Hi there, and welcome back to our series on Eschatology, Eschatology 101. This is the fifth session, and we are working our way through the book of Revelation, and we get ourselves into Revelation chapter 6. And just so you remember where we're coming from here, we're approaching the book of Revelation with the understanding that it's a difficult book, and it's full of different kinds of statements. It's full of symbols, and it's full of plain statements. And so one of the great challenges of the book of Revelation is to understand what verses are meant to be taken plainly because they're stated plainly, and what verses are meant to be taken symbolically because they're stated symbolically. So the first challenge as we come to any particular passage in this book is to ask ourselves the questions, are we reading a symbol or are we reading a plain and indicative statement? The second challenge before us is when we come to these symbols is not to look at the world around us and try to fit what we see in the world around us to those particular symbols, but to try to understand these symbols biblically. So that means going through our Old Testaments, because we remember that the original audience of the book of Revelation were first century Christians who would have received this letter from John in the mail, and they would have a working knowledge of the Old Testament. So many of the symbols that he's using to convey his message to his readers find their fulfillment in the Bible. And what that means is simply that he's taking symbols from the Old Testament and using them to convey his message. So those are our operating rules as we come to the book of Revelation. And one of the first things that we noticed as we began to look at Revelation chapter 1 is the time indicators that seem to be not symbols but plain indicative statements. John said that this was a revelation about Jesus Christ, which was given to him about the things that must soon take place. And that's not a symbolic statement. When Jesus told John that these are the things that must soon take place, that wasn't a symbol for things that would be taking place thousands of years later. Instead, we're taking the approach that John meant that plainly. The events and the details of the book of Revelation were for a first century audience, first century readers, and they were about the things that were happening in the first century. Later on in the very first chapter, we see that the time is near, that even those who pierce him will see these events. And so we take those time indicators to give us some clues as we interpret these difficult symbols. So that's where we are, and what we've seen so far is some letters to some specific churches that existed in the first century, and Jesus giving words of encouragement to his church, that he is walking in amongst the lampstands, which symbolize the churches. He's with his church in the midst of persecution. And then John gets lifted up, and he begins to see visions of the throne room and visions of God, and in the throne room, one who looked like a son of man. And where we are as we come to chapter 6, which is where we are in our study, is we see that the Lamb himself, that is Jesus himself, the object of praise and glory in heaven, has taken the scroll out of the hand of God himself, out of the hand of the Ancient of Days. And this scroll, we went back to Ezekiel, because that's where in the Old Testament we see this symbol of a scroll that was written on the front and the back and was sealed. And so if we go to Ezekiel and we recognize that that seal lists judgments against the enemies of God's people, then what we understand that we saw here was John, who describes himself in chapter 1 as a fellow partaker in the tribulation, was undergoing great persecution like his other brothers and sisters in the first century church, and was looking for God to alleviate their sufferings by judging God's enemies, the enemies of God's people. And that's what the scroll is all about. And so we saw the Lamb take the scroll out of the hand of God himself, and we get to chapter 6 where these seals begin to be opened, because of course it says in chapter 5 that Jesus is the one who is worthy to open the scroll. So that's where we are, and we're in chapter 6, and it starts off this way. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say like a voice of thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Now, because we're taking maybe a different approach than what some of you might be used to in the book of Revelation, many of us understand the book of Revelation to be about things that will take place in our future, things that will take place at the end of time. And so many futurists they come to this particular chapter and they see the beginning of what they call the Great Tribulation, the beginning of the end times. And so when they see this rider on the white horse, they think of the Antichrist. The Antichrist is a term that doesn't show up in the book of Revelation at all. Some equate the Antichrist with the beast, which we'll get to when we get to Revelation chapter 13. But the Antichrist is a term that shows up in 1st and 2nd John. Or they equate this with the man of lawlessness or some sort of end times political figure who rises to power. I think if we're just going to look at the text here, I think that we're not going to find that. What we see here, so I looked and behold a white horse. So we have to ask ourselves the question, in Scripture, what does white symbolize? And indeed, in this exact chapter, we're going to see that the people of God, those who have been martyred and are with God reigning in heaven, are clothed in white robes. And certainly we've already seen that the elders are clothed in white robes. We saw that Jesus' hair was as white as snow, looking like the Ancient of Days, who's described in Daniel chapter 7, with hair as white as snow. It's told that Jesus washes our sins as white as snow. And so white throughout Scripture seems to declare purity, forgiveness, blamelessness, imputed righteousness of Christ. And so these are things that you would expect a white horse symbolizes somebody good. So we can't say that the rider of this white horse is the Antichrist. I think it would be unbiblical for us to take that white horse and what the white might represent and apply that to an enemy of God. So just looking at the text, there's a white horse, and its rider had a bow and a crown, symbolizing military power and authority. Again, who do we expect to see here dressed in white or riding a white horse, who is able to conquer, who has a bow, who has military strength, but also has a crown symbolizing authority? And I would argue that I think the rider of this white horse we're seeing is Christ. And if you want further proof of that, look at this. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Now that word, it's an interesting word. It's actually the word Nike, which is where we get the name for the popular sports shoes and things of that nature. But the word itself means to be victorious or to conquer. Well, we've seen this throughout the book of Revelation, this word, to him who overcomes. It's the same word. We heard that spoken to every single one of the churches. And so already in the book of Revelation, this word has only been applied to Christ and to the people of Christ. In fact, if you search the entire New Testament, this word is not applied to anybody other than Christ and to the people of Christ. And so to apply this word to some enemy of God would be unbiblical, and there's no precedent for us to do that. So here we go. This is the opening of the 7 seals, and these 7 seals close up the scroll, which is judgments against the enemies of God's people. And the first one we see, as it's opened, a white horse comes out, and its rider is Christ himself, coming out to conquer, to overcome, as he's already promised his people that he will be able to do. And so what we're about to see is, as these judgments come forth, the judgments written on this scroll, that these 7 seals are being broken off, isn't a chronological order of events that are going to happen, but what we're seeing here are symbols. And the first symbol we're to recognize is that Christ himself, the rider of the white horse, the one who promises that we can overcome, the one who promises he will overcome, is at the head of it. He's the one who dictates and controls everything that we're about to read. And so as the seals continue to break off, let's see what they say. So verse 3, and he, that is the Lamb, that is Christ, opened the second seal. I heard the second living creature say, come. And out came another horse, bright red, and its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Now, I've already said that throughout the book of Revelation, the Greek word that is translated earth is the exact same Greek word that's translated as land, and so it's the translator's choice whether he translates it as earth and land. And I think what we're going to see is that there are many of those who translate the book of Revelation come to the original text with their preconceived ideas about what the book of Revelation is all about, and we see that in how they choose to translate some of these words. A better example of that is coming up, but right here, when it says to take peace from the earth, it's the same word as land, and I would argue that probably it's more accurate for us to read this as its rider was permitted to take peace from the land. So this red horse, red symbolizing blood and war, was permitted to take peace from the land. Now, again, what you have to remember is that Jesus was actually born at a very unique time in world history. In AD 17, the Caesar Augustus declared that this was the time of Pax Romana, that is Roman peace. Rome had essentially conquered the known world, and through their conquering and their subduing of rival nations, Rome ruled in relative peace. And so Jesus and his disciples grew up in and enjoyed a time of peace, of Pax Romana, Roman peace. And so it was interesting when Jesus said in Matthew 24 that you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Those who are listening at that time are thinking, "Whoa, war? We don't know about that. That's not something that we see around us." And we are living in the Pax Romana. This was supposed to be the end of all war. This was supposed to be the peace that would extend throughout the rest of the world as Rome continued to rule the world. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, in fact, that I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He says that in Matthew chapter 10. And so here we see the rider of the white horse, Christ himself, opening up the seal, and in opening up the second seal, peace was taken from the earth. War came upon the earth. Now, it's interesting because if you go to Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, he wrote a book called The Jewish Wars. And for any of you who want to understand the book of Revelation, and particularly want to understand this reading and this interpretation of the book of Revelation, that the possibility that this isn't about some distant future event, but is actually about first century events and what was going on in Jerusalem around 70 AD, within the lifetime of the disciples, as Jesus said in Matthew 24:34, then you should really get your hands on Josephus's The Jewish Wars. And it's interesting because he talks about this. He talks about the time when Roman peace, the Pax Romana, came to an end. And suddenly wars and rumors of wars began to spread throughout the entire world. The entire oikumene is the Greek word, the Roman political world. And so he talks about this, and he talks about the violence of those days. Think about the wickedness in human hearts that's pent up in a time of relative peace. Suddenly being unleashed in war and in rebellion against Rome, and Roman soldiers getting to have their fill of bloodshed that they've been craving for so long. So you can imagine what this time frame was like. And so once again, these seals, these judgments are talking about the things that are taking place leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And war is one of those things that came about. It hadn't been there prior to. Verse 5, it says, "When he opened the third seal, I heard from a third living creature say, 'Come,' and looked and beheld a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.'" Now, for those of us who might be hearing that and hearing those prices, it might not mean much to us, but what you need to know is that this is speaking of inflation. It's talking about the great demand for and the great need for and the great price of food. It's talking about famine. This black horse and its rider symbolize famine. And again, this is something that Jesus prophesied would take place within the lifetime of the disciples, leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, because remember, that's what the disciples asked him. When will these things be? When will the temple be destroyed? And he begins to give them all of these things, wars and rumors of wars. That is the second seal. Also famine. And again, if you read Josephus here, he talks about the horrible famine that took place. In fact, in the book of Acts, you'll read of a first century Christian who had a word from the Lord talking about the famine that would break out during the time of Emperor Claudius, and it would continue to stretch on until 70 AD. And so during the events of the time that John is writing this, there's great famine in the land. And Josephus talks about how people would break into other people's homes looking for wheat and for barley, and they would kill the owners of the house if they thought that they were hiding anything. And to the point where there was cannibalism within the city of Jerusalem simply because people were starving to death. It was a terrible, terrible time. And so the third seal symbolizes famine. Verse 7 says, "When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come.'" Now, all four living creatures, which we saw in the previous chapter, which are pulled from both Isaiah and Ezekiel when they got visions of the throne room, all four have now spoken. They've said, "Come." And so we get these four seals placed together. I heard the voice of the fourth creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. Now, just a point here, and this is another instance where Bible translators, as they're translating some of these words, begin to show their preconceived ideas, their presuppositions. The word pale horse here, and depending on your translation, some of it might say an ashen horse, or a pale or a sickly horse. My Bible here in the ESV says pale horse. The word that's translated here, pale, is actually the Greek word chloros. And if that sounds familiar to you, it should. It's where we get the words for chloroform. It's green. The Greek word means green. In fact, elsewhere in the book of Revelation, specifically in chapter 8, it talks about the green grass. And there they translate the same word green. But they don't put it here, even though a word-for-word translation would render this a green horse. And it's interesting, so you might ask the question, well, why not translate it as a green horse? And here you see the translators' presuppositions that, there's no such thing as a green horse. And if they think that they're looking at a literal picture of conquerors going out during some sort of great tribulation, well, then they have a problem on their hands, because there's no such thing as a green horse. And so I would say we should translate this as the way that John intended it to. That should say a green horse, which is actually a hint for us to understand that what we're looking at here is symbols. We're not looking at a literal four horsemen who are coming out to make war and to create pestilence, but what we're looking at is symbols of riders who come out bringing war and famine and pestilence. And that's what this green horse symbolizes. It says its rider's name is Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence by wild beasts of the earth. So there's an end to the section of those particular things, war and famine and pestilence. And we see the riders of those horses, but that's only 4 seals. We still have 3 left, so let's continue. Verse 9 says this, "When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness that they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, 'O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge your blood on those who dwell on the earth?' Then they were each given a white robe." Here's the white symbolizing blamelessness, symbolizing forgiveness. They were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were killed as they themselves had been. So you recognize that what's going on here is we're seeing a great tribulation that's coming upon the land of Israel. That is war, which hasn't been around since the Pax Romana. We see famine, which hadn't happened because under Roman rule, Rome made sure that all of their subjected nations to avoid revolt would be well fed. We also see pestilence, that is disease. And Josephus again talks at great lengths about the diseases and the cesspool of all various kinds of illnesses that broke out because of the inhumane conditions when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies and under siege when Rome marched against Jerusalem. And because of the lack of food and because of the war and because of the dead bodies, all kinds of pestilence broke out. But here we see, with the 5th seal, a vision of those who have been martyred, those who died because of their testimony. And they're up with God, and they're given a white robe. And the question is, how long until you avenge us, Lord? So we died by proclaiming your name. We died because we would not bow the knee to someone else. We died because we stayed true to our Christian testimony. How long until you avenge us? How long until you march against the enemies of God's people? Which works in our context here because we understand that the scroll that is being opened as these seals are broken off is the judgments against the enemies of God's people. It's God moving exactly in the way that those who've been martyred are asking him. How long until you avenge us? And the answer that's given is wait until the full number of your brothers and sisters are brought in. In other words, there are more to be martyred. There are more Christians who are going to lose their lives, and there are more to be brought in and to be saved. And I will avenge you, but not until I'm done saving whom I need to save. And more on that in the next chapter. But verse 12, let's continue. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by the gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that was being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Now, if we're to understand these as events that took place in the first century, surely we must come to these verses and say, how can we possibly understand that this has already happened? How can we possibly begin to imagine that these great earthquakes came, that the sun became black, that the full moon became red like blood, that stars fell out of the sky? How can we understand that? And I will say a couple of things. First of all, recognize that all of these things, all of the results here, directly correspond to what Matthew prophesied would happen during the lifetime of the disciples in Matthew chapter 24 and in Luke chapter 21. During the Olivet Discourse, Jesus talks, right? You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. He talks about pestilence and death. He talks about famine and darkness and sword, and he talks about being persecuted and being killed as martyrs, and he talks about earthquakes, and he talks about the sun being darkened and the moon failing to give its light. He talks about all those things in the Olivet Discourse. And he says that these things will take place, verse 34 of Matthew 24, before this generation passes away. So he said all these things would come to pass, and all these things would come to pass before the generation to whom he was speaking, the generation of his disciples, before they died, everything here would happen. Well, here we are 40 years later within the generation, and John is saying these things must shortly take place. And now we're getting pictures of these things actually happening. But what of this terrible, cataclysmic, end-of-the-world kind of language? Moon becoming like blood, sun becoming black, stars falling out of the sky. I won't go there with you because we don't have time to go through all of these different things, but I want you to go and I want you to read Isaiah chapter 13 and Isaiah chapter 19. Isaiah chapter 13 is a vision of Babylon falling, the great city of Babylon being judged by God. Isaiah chapter 19 is a vision of Egypt, enemy of God being judged by God. The language that Isaiah uses to describe both of those nations falling is very similar to the language that's being used here in the book of Revelation about another nation falling. So it talks about in Isaiah chapter 13, the sun failing to give its light, the moon being turned to blood, stars falling out of the sky. And he's not talking about the sun actually failing to give its light. He's talking about the stars, or the light of Babylon being put out. The lights are going out on Babylon. God is judging this nation. This nation will fall because any nation that God moves against in judgment will fall. Similarly, in Isaiah chapter 19, talking about Egypt, talking about the sun failing to give its light, stars being thrown to the earth. There it also talks about God coming on the clouds in judgment and the hearts of the Egyptians melting like wax within them. Well, there was no time in Egypt's history when God literally came on the clouds and everybody's hearts melted into wax. It's talking figuratively about the fall of a nation. And so throughout the Bible, when prophets talk about the fall of a nation, they use this sort of cataclysmic language because it is the end of an era. It's the end of the world as the Babylonians knew it, as the Egyptians knew it. And here, I believe what we're seeing is that as God moves against the enemies of God's people, we recognize, because we've read the book of Acts, who were the enemies of God's people? Who were the enemies of the Christians? Well, Acts chapter 8 verse 1 tells us that a great persecution broke out against the church that day, and it was Israel as a nation. It was the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees who began to persecute God's people. And so we're talking about the fall of Israel as a nation, the fall of Jerusalem here, as Rome begins to mount its armies and move on the city of Jerusalem. And we're going to see that in the coming chapters, but that's what this is talking about. And interestingly, if you want further proof that this is talking about what happened in the first century, let's finish the chapter here. Verse 15 says this: "Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling on the mountains, and the rocks fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" Now it's interesting that Josephus actually talks about when Rome marched on Jerusalem, when they actually began to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, that the high priests and the Pharisees outside the temple began to yell out, "This is the wrath of the Lamb," coming from this. But let's go to the Bible instead of just to Josephus and to history, and let's see where else this language is used. If you go to Luke chapter 23, I'll start in verse 26. "And as they led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross and carry it behind Jesus." So what's going on here is this is the time when Jesus is being crucified. He'd just been whipped and scourged and beaten. He was given a giant plank that they would attach to the vertical beam, which would be his cross, and they're having him carry it to Golgotha. And of course, Jesus, in his weakened condition, wasn't able to do so, and so they enlist Simon of Cyrene to carry Jesus' cross for him. But listen to verse 27. So here's Jesus walking to the cross, beaten, scourged, and it says, "And there followed him a great multitude of people, and of women who are mourning and lamenting for him," which of course any good and decent person would do, looking at this innocent man who is being beaten and who is bloody and who is going to be crucified. Verse 28, "But turning to them, Jesus said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say, Mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?'" Now, listen to that language. They will say to the mountains, "Fall on us," and they will say to the hills, "Cover us." And here we go in Revelation chapter 6, calling out to the mountains and to the rocks, "Fall on us, hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne." And so Jesus was prophesying in Luke chapter 23, and he was prophesying about what would take place within the lifetime of his disciples, just as he had said in the Olivet Discourse, and just as he had said to these particular women, "Don't mourn for me, mourn for yourselves, because there's a time that's coming on Jerusalem within your lifetime when people will say to the rocks, 'Fall on us.' It's better for us to die than to continue to undergo this persecution." And this is what these seals are. As the seals continue to break off, it is the judgments of God against the enemies of his people, and it is God beginning to move against Israel. And we're going to see that a little bit more clearly in Revelation chapter 7. So I hope you can join us for our next session.